Hi everyone, we're continuing to read Holes by Louis Sacco. Yesterday we learned about the character Stanley Yelnats going to Camp Green Lake and that he would be digging a hole every single day. The hole would have to be 5 feet wide and 5 feet deep. There were no gates or guards around Camp Green Lake because there didn't need to be. There was no chance to escape because there was no water for hundreds of miles. Chapter 5. There were 6 large grey tents and each one had a black letter on it, A, B, C, D, E or F. The first 5 tents were for the campers. The counsellor slept in F. Stanley was assigned to D tent. Mr. Pendanski was his counsellor. My name is easy to remember, said Mr. Pendanski as he shook hands with Stanley just outside the tent. 3 easy words, Pendanski. Mr. Sir returned to the office. Mr. Pendanski was younger than Mr. Sir and not nearly as scary looking. The top of his head was shaved so close it was almost bald, but his face was covered in a thick curly black beard. His nose was badly sunburned. Mr. Sir isn't really so bad, said Mr. Pendanski. He's just been in a bad mood ever since he quit smoking. The person you've got to worry about is the warden. There's really only one rule at Camp Green Lake. Don't upset the warden. Stanley nodded as if he understood. I want you to know, Stanley, that I respect you, Mr. Pendanski said. I understand you've made some bad mistakes in your life, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But everyone makes mistakes. You may have done some bad things, but that doesn't mean you're a bad kid. Stanley nodded. It seemed pointless to try to tell his counsellor that he was innocent. He figured that everyone probably said that. He didn't want Mr. Pendanski to think he had a bad attitude. I'm going to help turn your life around, said his counsellor. But you're going to have to help too. Can I count on your help? Yes, sir, Stanley said. Mr. Pendanski said, good, and patted Stanley on the back. 2 boys, each carrying a shovel, were coming across the compound. Mr. Pendanski called to them. Rex, Alan, I want you to come say hello to Stanley. He's the newest member of our team. The boys glanced wearily at Stanley. They were dripping with sweat and their faces were so dirty that it took Stanley a moment to notice that one kid was white and the other black. What happened to Bath Bug? Asked the black kid. Lewis is still in the hospital, said Mr. Pendanski. He won't be returning. He told the boys to come shake Stanley's hand and introduce themselves, like gentlemen. Hi, the white kid grunted. That's Alan, said Mr. Pendanski. My name's not Alan, the boy said. It's Squid, and that's X-Ray. Hey, said X-Ray. He smiled and shook Stanley's hand. He wore glasses, but they were so dirty that Stanley wondered how he could see out of them. Mr. Pendanski told Alan to go to the rec hall and bring the other boys to meet Stanley. Then he led them inside the tent. There were 7 cots, 1 was each one less than 2 feet from the next to it. Which was Lewis's cot? Mr. Pendanski asked. Bath Bag slept here, said X-Ray, kicking at one of the beds. All right, Stanley, that'll be yours, said Mr. Pendanski. Stanley looked at the cot and nodded. He wasn't particularly thrilled about sleeping in the same cot that had been used by somebody named Bath Bag. 7 crates were stacked in 2 piles at one side of the tent. The open end of the crates faced outward. Stanley put his backpack, change of clothes and towel in what used to be Bath Bag's crates. It was at the bottom of the stack that had 3 in it. Squid returned with 4 other boys. The first 3 were introduced by Mr. Pendanski as Jose, Theodore and Ricky. They called themselves Magnet, Armpit and Zigzag. They all have nicknames, explained Mr. Pendanski. However, I prefer to use the names their parents gave them, the names that society will recognise them by when they return to become useful and hard-working members of society. It ain't just a nickname, X-Ray told Mr. Pendanski. He tapped the rim on his glasses. I can see inside you, Mom. You've got a big, fat heart. The last boy either didn't have a real name or else he didn't have a nickname. But Mr. Pendanski and X-Ray called him Zero. You know why his name's Zero? Asked Mr. Pendanski. Because there's nothing inside his head. He smiled and playfully shook Zero's shoulder. Zero said nothing. And that's Mum, a boy said. Mr. Pendanski smiled at him. If it makes you feel better to call me Mum. Theodore, go ahead and call me Mum. He turned to Stanley. If you have questions, Theodore will help you. You got that, Theodore? I'm depending on you. Theodore spit a thin line of saliva between his teeth, causing some of the other boys to complain about the need to keep their home sanitary. You were all new here once, said Mr. Pendanski, and you all know what it feels like. I'm counting on every one of you to help Stanley. Stanley looked at the ground. Mr. Pendanski left the tent, and soon the other boys began to file out as well, taking their towels and change of clothes with them. Stanley was relieved to be left alone, but he was so thirsty he felt as if he would die if he didn't get something to drink soon. Hey, Theodore, he said, going after him. Do you know where I can fill my canteen? Theodore whirled and grabbed Stanley by his collar. My name's not Theodore, he said. It's Armpit. He threw Stanley to the ground. Stanley stared up at him, terrified. There's a water spigot on the wall of the shower wall. Thanks, Armpit, said Stanley. As he watched the boy turn and walk away, he couldn't for the life of him figure out why anyone would want to be called Armpit. In a way, it made him feel a little better about having to sleep in a cot that had been used by somebody named Bath Bag. Maybe it was a term of respect.